I was what you would call a sober child. Anyone else here a sober child? Anyone? Anyone? Kinda? Yeah, I really didn't think so. As a sober child, I did things like eating only the adult cereal, or when we had family karaoke one time at a reunion, I chose this really slow, folksy, beautiful song about how you can never return home again. I was in like middle school. And everyone got so bored of the song that midway through they cut me off and said, "Next." So that was me. One other thing that I did was that every now and then I'd gather up my siblings and we'd walk down the road 5 minutes to my great grandmother's house because I thought she's a lonely old woman. She could probably use a visit. And while my siblings played in her house, I sat on her couch and tried to make small talk with my great grandma. I was in elementary school at the time. I know of no other elementary school aged kid who would willingly walk 5 minutes to go visit an 80, 90-year-old woman and make small talk. But I did that. And I'm rather happy that I did, because I'm sure that my great grandma did enjoy those visits. I mean, she probably thought I was really weird, but she was a lonely old woman. She lived by herself. She had a hard time getting around, and she didn't do much. I don't remember what we talked about. I remember her house, and I remember that I did it and why I did. Later on, when I was in high school, I had the chance to help take care of another of my great-grandmas. This one we called Oma. She was from Germany and moved to America and Utah in 1950. Oma got into her late 90s and was no longer able to live on her own and started bouncing back and forth between her two daughters' homes. And on Friday evenings, my family took a turn taking care of her to give my grandma and grandpa a break. Sometimes I would go by myself to help take care of Oma, who by now was like 100 years old, literally. She lived to be 101, almost 102. But Oma and I would sit on the couch and watch TV together, and we'd talk a little bit. One of my favorite memories, just because it makes me laugh, is I served soup once, soup pot, middle of the table, and I had a spoon, like that was the size of the spoon head, in this pot to help serve it. And we had spoons, normal size spoons, right, to eat with. And I remember Oma looking at her little spoon, looking at the big spoon in the pot, looking at me, looking at the big spoon in the pot, looking at me, and then slowly reaching forward to grab the big spoon in the pot, and she started to eat with that instead. It was like she was saying to herself, "Is this okay? She gave me a very little spoon. I don't eat with spoons this small. What do I do?" And making sure everything was okay and she wasn't going to offend me by taking out the big spoon and eating with that instead. I was like, Germans must eat with bigger spoons. That was all my response was. I thought it was hilarious. I learned great things from Oma, and she's one of my big role models. She lived through World War II in Germany, and her husband was drafted to serve in the military. He wasn't a Nazi, but when they write you a note and say, "Hey, you got to join the military," "Yes, sir, I will join the military." Luckily for him, he was captured before he saw any combat, as far as I'm aware, and spent his 3 years in the military prison in France, eating a whole lot of peas, from what I've been told. And that whole time, he didn't know where his family was, because they had to move around a little bit because the war was going on. And by the end of the war, their city was 70% gone. So they were moving around a bunch. He didn't know where they were. They didn't know if he was even alive, but both sides were still writing letters, and they were hoping that those letters would reach where they were supposed to go. They didn't. And at the end of the war, Oma's husband, was able to figure out where the family was, and they got back together. They tried for years to immigrate to America, were finally able to do so in 1950. That's about all I knew about the story until last year, when I started interviewing my grandma, Oma's daughter. We put her life story book together this year, and believe it or not, I had to talk her into talking about Germany. Not because it was so traumatic, but because she thought no one would be interested. That's right, no one would be interested about what it was like to live in Germany during World War II. And beyond that, she didn't want to talk about any of the bad or gross things, like how she had lice, or that they had one bathtub for the entire apartment building that they all had to share. And every now and then, they would finally get a chance to use the bathtub. And between times, they had to do sponge baths. She didn't want to talk about any of it. She wanted life to have been nice, which I can see. But when that book came out, my dad read that book, the Germany chapter. He was like, this is all new. I've never heard any of this. My mom's never talked about Germany at all. And there are so many things in there that helped make, like, Opa is a person now. Whereas before, he was a man who went to France and ate a whole lot of peas instead of serving in the military. Well, serving in the military. And I make sense now. I understand why my grandma never returned to Germany, not even for a visit. Because her dad, when they finally got over to America, whenever people would ask him, hey, ever want to go back? Ever want to visit? His response was pretty much, good riddance to Germany. I'm never going back. I worked so hard to get away from that place. I'm out. And my grandma said she feels the same way. Oma did go back for a visit once, for the record, after her husband had passed away. But it makes me very proud to be an American to hear how hard they worked to get here, that they had to try for years and years, and that they were so happy to be here, and that I am here partially because they worked that hard and because it meant so much to them. I was proud to be an American before, but it adds more depth that wasn't there before. Changing gears a little bit right now. I worked at a newspaper in Idaho for a few years. And at a daily newspaper, someone needs to work Christmas. It was my first year there. I worked Christmas. And I didn't have family in Idaho, so I was by myself for Christmas that year. My grandma found that out, different grandma, and said, you know what? I think I have a cousin who lives up there. Here's her address. Okay. Knocked on this lady's door. Hi, are you Elizabeth Crawford? My name's Elizabeth Thomas. My grandma is Peg Castino, your cousin. She immediately welcomed me into her home. And it was like we were family that fast. She shared so many family stories, and I went back so many times, and I had family in Idaho after that. One of my favorite family stories, and by the way, this family is the McAllister family that my grandma and Elizabeth Crawford were both members of. One of my favorite stories is that back in the day, Elizabeth Crawford was traveling through Utah and she stopped to go to church. She introduced herself at the start of the meeting to a few people. And then when the meeting started, the person got up to the pulpit and said, and Sister Crawford will be playing the piano for us while we sing the hymns. Okay, then. She goes up to the front and she played the piano while they all sang the hymns. And after the meeting, she said, how did you know I even know how to play the piano? And they said, oh, you're a McAllister. All McAllisters play the piano. And it's true, she could play the piano. And you know what? That has trickled down, and I play the piano. Not all the McAllister descendants do, but it's like my mom made sure all of us learned a musical instrument. And part of that came from that family legacy. A very musical family, very musical reputation. Another family reputation I ran into in Idaho was I wrote in the newspaper that the Thomas family I'd married into came from Eastern Idaho. And somebody wrote into the newspaper to say, oh my gosh, you're one of those Thomases. And they were all sorts of excited. And I was like, it's a good thing those Thomases are good people, right? Because I didn't know that I was going to be running into people who knew my people. But there was a family identity there. In America, we place a huge emphasis on individual identities. It's all about who you are, what makes you unique, what are your talents, what can you offer, what's on your resume, what are your dreams and ambitions. And we focus a whole lot less on family identity, on what it means to be a Thomas or a McAllister or a Taylor or a Rauscher or a Kirby. Like, what does that mean? And I'm sure that all of you have some idea of what that means. For me, I was raised a Burns, and that means that we ski in Deer Valley and Park City. The Burnses were part of the families that helped create the ski town that Park City is now. So when I go skiing in Deer Valley in particular, there's a lot of family pride and the idea that this is where great grandpa skied way back in the day. He helped make this. Husband, by the way, of the woman that I went to go visit, who is 5 minutes down the road. That family identity gives me pride whenever it comes up. It gives meaning to a bunch of what I do and who I am. There's a false idea that when you're born, you're given a blank slate, because you're not. Instead, you're given a slate that's filled with your family and the people who came before you. You were born a Burns. You were born a Hanson. And that means something. I've spoken with people who were adopted, who were literally given a blank slate. And there's a sense of loss there. They don't have the context in their lives that the rest of us have, those who weren't adopted, those who know who their ancestors were. We know where we fit in the world. We know what our ancestors were doing. I can be very proud to be an American because I know what was sacrificed to bring me here. And in that way, I am my ancestors' legacy. The things they worked for created me and my life, the same way your ancestors created you and your life. And what you do today creates your children and their children's children's lives. And that's a big part of why family history and your stories are important. They matter. They give context, they give reason, and they give role models. I look up to Oma so much. And the idea is that because she went through such hard things and her blood goes through my veins, I can go through hard things. I know that I am capable of a lot because she was capable of a lot. She was taking care of 2 children and her parents in the middle of World War II while wondering where her husband was. And nobody ended up like very angry or hurt or, everything was okay, which is a miracle. There's a lot of faith in that family. And that's one of my legacies too. One that I'm hoping to pass on to my children. There are many different ways that you can pass on your stories and those of your ancestors, right? Because your family history is also your history. Your life is adding to it. This past summer, I had a cool chance to go and explore Fish Lake National Forest with my husband's family. And as we were going around, my husband's dad started guiding us in a certain direction, and then he goes, "Do you see that cabin over there?" "Yes." "I used to live there." "Oh, did you?" It's like a 10 by 8 foot cabin with the outhouse out, to the side with like the moon on the door and everything. Yeah, one of those. Had the best view in the world and this old like metal spring mattress that was, you could only see the springs now. And he used to do some gold mining and he lived there at the time. That was the coolest thing, to be able to stand in that cabin and say, "You lived here?" And it made it so much more real. If you have the ability or the chance to show your past to your kids, to your siblings, to your grandkids, do it. If you can take them to those places, if you can show them those heirlooms, whatever you can do to make it real, that's the greatest. But that's not as permanent as writing it down. Journaling is awesome. If you can journal, if you're a journaler, you can write daily, you can write weekly, you can write yearly, or just when major events happen, or when you're feeling particularly emotional. But the things that you write down are the things that will be remembered and remembered and remembered and remembered, because those have permanence that people can read. If you are not a writer, you can take a photo journal. My dad does that. Once a day, he'll take a picture. And it's not abnormal that after Thanksgiving or during Thanksgiving, he'll back up and take a picture of everybody eating. And we're like, this is a dumb picture, Dad, but whatever. Because he's taking pictures of things that happened, things that matter to him. If you choose to do a photo journal, make sure to write captions. You got to do at least that much writing, because later on down the line, people won't know who's in the picture or why you took it. So you need to write those two things down, even if it's just Thanksgiving 2020, Bob and Nola. That's all. It doesn't need to be really fancy. If that isn't even your groove, you can do an audio or a video journal. Our cell phones right now are amazing for that sort of thing. There's so many apps where you can just hit record and talk into it while you're driving, or make a video sometimes. My husband and I did that at what we thought was the middle of the COVID epidemic, but it was in March. So we made one of those while we were out there, and nowadays we laugh at it and say, ha, you were not in the middle of it, but good try. And we gave an update about what was going on in the world and in our lives. We made another similar video update in November and mentioned the fact that, yeah, that was not the middle of things, but good job. Video and audio have the chance to make sure that your voice comes through and your mannerisms in a way that photo and writing won't. Just make sure that you have backups for video, audio, photo, for your writing, whatever it is. More than one copy is great. I had a man tell me once that his dad died and left behind a bunch of music cassette tapes. And the man was listening to them while doing a workout one day, running laps. And then suddenly the music stopped and he heard his dad's voice say, I have decided to start recording my life story. End of workout. And he's listening, and 20 minutes later, the cassette is done. And you better believe that he went and listened to every single other cassette tape in his dad's entire collection. And that was it. He hadn't recorded any more than that, just 20 minutes. However, that was 20 minutes that wouldn't have been there otherwise. 20 minutes of his dad's voice and 20 minutes of stories. Just amazing. What a treasure. And amazing that he found it too. Lesson, apparently listen to old cassette tapes before you put them away in the yard sale. One final thing, idea, if none of those sound good to you, but you're on social media, your social media is a journal. A lot of people will note down the big events in their lives or some of their thoughts or reflections about what's been going on. They'll post pictures. If you print that out, put it in a 3-ring binder, golden. Your story is now down. No extra effort. These stories matter, whatever way you find to make sure to share them. They need to be shared. Your stories, the stories of your ancestors, they give that context. They give something for people to reach for. People get kind of lost without them. So make sure to share them. Thank you.
Of our meeting, we have, as we did speakers, one evaluator. So, Dave, we'll get you your 2 to 3 minutes to give an unadulterated analysis and evaluation of Elizabeth's speech. Time is yours.
Thank you, Kevin. As I went to email out all of you with regards to Toastmasters, I saw that there was no evaluation for Elizabeth's speech, and I jumped at the chance. I was so excited to be able to evaluate this. And what a great speech it was. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for sharing all of these fun memories and fun things. So you started out with your speech and you said, "I'm a sober child." And unfortunately, I didn't quite know what that meant. So I'm grateful that you clarified that and kind of said what a sober child was. It's always a little scary asking a question at the beginning, seeing if people, Kevin jumped at it. I'm kind of a sober child. And I looked at it and said, I don't even know what that means. I know I haven't drinking alcohol since I was a kid when I was not a sober child. But so we found out what a sober child was. And as you went along with your speech, I said, yes, this is definitely a sober person. I like this. Now I have another clarification of how I can classify Elizabeth Thomas, a sober child. A 19-minute, 20-minute speech is really hard to evaluate because there's so many good things that we want to talk about and so many things that we want to look at. So a few things I really liked. I loved your hand gestures. I think you did that purposely to put the camera in such a way that you could show your hands and do this. Oftentimes in Zoom, I'm showing my hands like this, and all you see are my shoulders moving. You distinctively did this, and you did some great things. When you're talking about Oma's soup, and you're doing this, and you're showing us, and you're getting us involved, and we're starting to see some emotions just with your hands and the things that you're doing. I loved when you kind of got mad and you said you were talking about a journal. Sorry, I'm going to jump to the end of this for a sec, but you were talking about a journal, and you said, if you're going to do a picture journal, write something down, and you brought some emotion to it. You're like, yes, you can't just show pictures. We won't. You might remember who these pictures are today, but next year you're going to go, who is this person? I don't know who they are, and so it's important to write that down. You smiled so big when you talked about your children's. And Lindy, I don't even care what the time is. It doesn't matter. I'm going over. So when you shared that with me, there was this huge smile and a huge bit of emotion. And we really got into who you are. You care about family. And we got that from the rest of the story. But when you started talking about your own children, and there was a hope of, okay, I'm going to have kids one day. I'm going to have grandkids one day. And there was a great feeling of emotion that came out when you started talking about that. A few things I want you to consider next time you possibly do this speech. You gave a lot of voice for older people, Oma and Opa. You shared with them. You're a sober child, like we said. Your emotion is a little harder to get out. People look at me and I'm, okay? Take the emotion of them and use it in their voice. I would have loved to see maybe an accent come out when you're talking about grandma or you're talking about grandpa. They're talking about Germany. In fact, you gave this big, good riddance to Germany. It would have been good riddance to Germany or something like that. Something that played into who these people were. We wanted to know who Oma and Opa were. And if you give them just a little bit more of a voice, other than your own, okay, that brings them into us. And we get to feel them a little bit more, okay? What you did was great, but we just heard you telling the story. We wanted, in a sense, to hear them tell the story. And being able to bring that emotion in just a little bit more. You talked about adoption. And I really kind of thought when you were talking about this, I really thought, be careful. Because you kind of mentioned people who are adopted don't have this sense of pride. And I'm not saying that's what you said, but that's kind of the way it came across, that only those that came from a real family have this, like, this ancestry. It's true that they're a different family, but I think someone who was adopted might have said, hey, I have pride in the family I'm in. And you might have more experience in that because you've worked with people who, it sounded like you would work with people who had been adopted. But from a listener standpoint, I just thought that's a little touchy. Just be a little careful when you're talking about that. Um, in closing, you talked about encouraging each one of us to do some sort of a journaling, some sort of a family history. I love that. That's the way we always want to close off any kind of a long talk like this, is to bring it back and give us a why. Why am I talking about Oma and Opa? It's because you want the person listening to grasp onto your purpose of the speech. And your purpose of the speech wasn't just to get us excited about your family, but get us excited about our family. And so it came along really nicely and it ended real well. And I'm grateful that you shared that with us. It was a great speech. Thank you.